Carol Kidwell Gilbert. I'm chair of the Archaeology Committee of the National Arts Club, and delighted to be addressing our audience after a long hiatus away since November. It's great to be back home. And may I remind everyone that masks must be worn throughout the National Arts Club. I will put mine back on once I'm done speaking, and then take it off a little later. So if you have a mask, I'm sorry, it's COVID regulations. We all feel the same way, and glad that the situation is rapidly changing for the better. Tonight you're going to witness a fascinating joint lecture entitled Tales from the Temple of Ishtar by Yale University professor Eckart Frahm, an internationally renowned scholar on ancient Assyria, and attorney Raymond Dowd, who serves on the National Arts Club Board of Governors. They explore the historical importance of the Flamenbaum gold tablet, its beauty and provenance, as well as the consequence of court rulings in determining ownership of this highly contested masterpiece from the past, a victim to warfare. But do realize that one of archaeology's prime lessons is that barbaric destruction of civilizations does not just occur in modern times, but harks back to earlier periods. America has a notable history of protecting cultural property. There were no laws governing taking enemy possessions in war until the instructions for the, and this is a quote, Government of Armies of the United States in the Field. You have it here. Written in 1863 by Francis Weber for the Union Army at the behest of President Abraham Lincoln. The Weber Code addresses both the need for vigilance and additional twin threats of destruction and looting. Weber wrote that structures devoted to religion or education or museums of fine arts and science should not be destroyed during armed conflict. And I'm quoting, classical works of art, libraries, scientific collections or precious instruments must be secured against unavoidable injury, even when they are contained in fortified places whilst besieged or bombarded. He added that such objects shall not be sold or given away, nor should they ever be privately appropriated or wantonly destroyed or injured. And that's a quote. The Hague Convention of 1899, revised in 1907, was the first global code of conduct protecting cultural heritage during armed struggles. The next key international agreement affirming the principle was the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict, and its two protocols of 1999. This landmark legislation prohibits the targeting of cultural sites, including museums, archaeological zones, libraries, archives, religious and historic structures. The United States became an early signatory to the 1970 United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property from the countries of origin to aid in preservation and confront the illegal trade threatening artworks, excavated antiquities, and ethnographic objects. Concerns with determination of provenance when required, the international arena in which politics often intervenes, continuing cultural catastrophe, all these relate. Some countries, such as Australia, Canada, and Germany, prohibit the import of illegally exported cultural objects. Other countries, such as Switzerland and the United States, prohibit the import of illegally exported archaeological and ethnographical materials, as long as there are supplemental bilateral agreements in place between themselves and the country of origin. And I want you to know that recently both Egypt and Cyprus, among other countries, came up for discussion about affirming and extending some of the agreements. And there were just these supplemental bilateral agreements in place. So it's very meaningful. In 1983, America further restricted importation of artifacts by affirming an obligation to disallow illegally exported cultural materials related to ongoing partnerships, cultural exchanges, traveling exhibitions, museum loans, research projects. Looting, a major problem encountered throughout the art world, remains a critical issue. How should this term be defined, and how should an artifact or group of stolen cultural treasures be handled? The complex situation involved in looting and its concomitant consequences are oftentimes difficult to resolve. Let me state, although not the topic at hand, this is most probably going to be germane with regards to Ukraine's numerous cultural treasures due to Putin's illegal, egregious, inhumane invasion of that sovereign nation. And I have to say as a side, I'm wearing the colors of the Ukrainian flag, which I thought was very applicable today. Treated also will be the spoils of war doctrine, not approved by the agreements, codes, conventions, laws already quoted, which allows art and cultural objects absconded during the course or immediate aftermath of fighting to become the possession of the taker. These will be among the issues discussed by Raymond J. Dowd, a partner in Dunnington, Barlow, and Miller. He participated in 2015's Archaeology Committee panel entitled Looting and the Plunder of Cultural Heritage. So he's one of our wanted guests for the club programs with his erudition and importance in the field. Ray rose to prominence in the mid-1990s as the litigator who successfully removed Doris Dukes Butler as co-executor of her estate, represents a number of Holocaust victims' families pursuing artworks looted by the Nazis, and wrote the Copyright Litigation Handbook, published in 2006, which has been updated annually. Professor Eckart Frahm discusses the artistic concept and context and significance of the gold tablet from Asher. An international authority in the field, he receives his doctorate from the University of Göttingen and his habilitation from Heidelberg University. Some of you, I did not know what habilitation meant, and I Googled it, and I think it's wonderful as a former college professor. It's additional studies preparing you to become a university professor. And I think that's wonderful that you went through that. These are all significant since tonight's lecture deals with German archaeology and history. An Assyriologist whose main fields of research is Assyrian and Babylonian history and Mesopotamian divinity and scholarly texts, he has authored 6 books, as well as countless articles. Professor Frahm has served in recent years as an expert witness in a few high-profile cases of trafficking in cultural artifacts from the Middle East, such as the one under discussion this evening. Before he begins, I would like to remind you of some of our previous programs. Dr. Jane Hickman lectured about the jewelry of Queen Puabi of Ur, dated approximately 2500 BCE, a Mesopotamian city in which Abraham lived. Professor Robert Cole spoke about the analogous Bronze Age in the once-forgotten kingdom of Alalak. Dr. Donald Sanders digitally reconstructed the 9th century BCE citadel of Nimrud located in Assyria. More general events included Colonel Matthew Badonich on the looting of Baghdad's artistic treasures, Dr. Oscar White Muscarella on forgeries and archaeology of the ancient Near East, strange bedfellows, with Robert Cole again, fit for the gods and kings, animal-shaped vessels in the ancient world, spanning diverse time periods and cultures. And I must say, this is a personal favorite of mine, Gertrude Margaret Lowenthal Bell, head of the Iraqi Antiquities, has been mentioned wherever appropriate. I now invite Professor Frahm to address our audience so we all will become enlightened about this evening's subject, followed by Raymond Dowd, who provides a better understanding of legal issues involved in winning this major case. Thank you.
So thank you for the invitation to you and to the Archaeology Committee of the National Arts Club. It's an honor to speak here. It's also a pleasure, I have to say. This, I think, is the first in-person presentation I'm giving outside Yale for almost 2 years. So please bear with me if I'm a little bit rusty, but nonetheless, it would be almost exhilarating if it weren't for those world events that Michelle has also mentioned right now. So, in the summer of 2006, I received an email from Ralf Wartke, the deputy director of the Vorderasiatisches Museum, the Museum for the Ancient Near East in Berlin, Germany. Wartke wrote to me about a 3,000-year-old gold tablet from an Assyrian temple that had gone missing at the Berlin Museum in 1945 in the wake of World War II, and that had allegedly resurfaced in the estate of a Holocaust survivor in Great Neck, New York, in 2003. The museum in Berlin was eager to reclaim ownership of that tablet and was ready to initiate legal proceedings for that purpose. And Wartke asked me to write a report, an expert report, about the likelihood that the tablet from the estate was actually the same that had gone missing in 1945. I accepted that, and on, I think, August 14th, went to Great Neck to look at that tablet and study it. I have to say it was a rather unique experience for me. It was the only time in my career as an archaeologist that I had to study a tablet, a cuneiform text with, I think, as many as 4 lawyers sort of looking over my shoulder. It was, yeah, slightly daunting, but not so daunting altogether that it wouldn't have been possible for me to establish with a great degree of certainty, and I give you some reasons as I continue with my lecture, that it was in fact the same tablet. That was not the end of the story. I submitted my report shortly thereafter, and it was then used not only in the first but also in the second trial that went on about that tablet. I'm not going to talk to you about these legal proceedings. It's going to be Ray Dowd who's going to do that. He was involved and he's an expert in that. I'm happy later on in the discussion to also share with you some of my own perspectives on this whole legal affair. But I would like to point out right away that I'm, of course, especially as a German, quite well aware of the moral conundrum, so to speak, that, well, an artifact that turns up in the estate of a Holocaust survivor would be reclaimed by a German museum. But my task tonight...
You know, I'm going to go and try to read to them.
Yeah, okay. How is that going? Is that better? Okay. All right. So my task tonight is to talk about the origin, the historical origin, the history of that tablet and its history of excavations. And that brings us back to the ancient kingdom of Assyria, depicted here on this map, which was centered on the Middle Tigris region in what is today the northern part of the Republic of Iraq, became a territorial state of significant size in the 14th century BCE, and the world's first empire in the 8th century BCE. And more precisely, you have to go back to the city of Ashur, marked on that slide by this red circle, where our tablet actually comes from. Ashur was a city of many temples, the most important of which was the temple of the god Ashur, the eponymous patron deity of the city, in the northeastern part, overseeing the Tigris River, but also of temples dedicated to the moon god and the sun god, to the weather god, the sky god, and a temple dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, the goddess from whose temple our tablet comes. You can see here on this slide where the red arrows are seen, where that temple was actually located. I took that photo on the right myself in 2001 when I spent some time as an epigrapher on the excavations that Ashur conducted at that time. Ishtar is the goddess of war and love, and since these are obviously remains of great significance, it sounded promising. Okay. Yeah, I try to sort of kneel down a little bit. All right. Feeling like the king. You will see the king kneeling down too in a moment. Anyway, so Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, was a very popular deity all over ancient Mesopotamia throughout the centuries. She's depicted here on the left side of the slide.
Thank you.
And she was also worshipped in Ashur. There were a number of temples built for her. The first one dating to the mid-3rd millennium, the last one to the 7th century BCE. You see them on the right on that slide over here in this palimpsest of temples, one erected on top of the other. And you may ask, why so many temples altogether? Well, in Mesopotamia, unlike in Egypt, temples were not built in stone because stone was rare in Mesopotamia. They were built with mud brick, and mud brick buildings just collapse after a few generations and therefore have to be replaced by new buildings. One of those temples, the temple from the 13th century BCE, the one marked on the slide on the right in dark gray, was erected during the reign of a king by the name of Tukulti-Ninurta I, of whom you have a depiction on the right. And I'm glad that I'm able to show you here at least one really sophisticated work of Assyrian art, given that this is the National Arts Club and not the National Philology Club or so. So this is really an interesting object. It is an altar on which the king is depicted twice, like in a comic strip, first standing, then kneeling, like I am right now, and worshipping an altar on the right that is, of course, essentially the same as the object on which this image is applied. So you have an example of what art historians call a mise en abîme with this stone object. This is a rather experimental piece of art. Nothing like that had existed prior to Tukulti-Ninurta. And that king was also quite revolutionary in other respects. He is the first Assyrian king to conquer Assyria's southern neighbor, Babylonia. He built a new city, and even more daring, a new temple of Ashur on the other side of the Tigris. And he had himself celebrated in almost godlike fashion in a royal epic. Tukulti-Ninurta's new Ishtar temple was also rather unusual. First, it was erected not exactly on top of the previous temple building, but slightly to the southwest of it. And the orientation of the main cella, the main sanctuary, had also been changed, shifted by roughly 90%. A new ante-cella, an antechamber called the Bichahu in Assyrian, had been added to it, facing the temple courtyard. And so it was in many respects a building quite different from the previous temple. The main cellar of the Assyrian Ishtar Ashurito, is room 3, the room in the center on the slide that you have on the right, where you see a 16-stair-long staircase leading up to a dais on which the statue of Ishtar was originally placed. In this main cellar, several building inscriptions written on stone tablets, but also on tablets made of lead, silver, and gold were found, buried in the foundations and in the walls. But our gold tablet, the one from the Flamenbaum estate, was actually not found in this main cellar, in this main sanctuary of the Assyrian Ishtar, but rather in a smaller cellar located in the southwest of the temple. We have again an arrow. And that little sanctuary was dedicated to a goddess, name is conventionally read as Dinitu, we're getting back to that. And in this side cellar, the gold tablet was buried under another stone dais that you find again marked on the map by an arrow. And you see a reconstruction of the temple by the excavator over there. So this is essentially how the building might have looked like originally. Here is the whole situation on a photo from the excavations. You see here the dais, the separation wall in the back has already been removed at this point. And under that dais was the gold tablet together with a silver tablet slightly bigger than the gold tablet, depicted here on the right, that had exactly the same text as the gold tablet. Now, what is that text all about? It's a building inscription that was meant to commemorate the building activities of the king, Tukulti-Ninurta, so that his memory would live on. When later kings would restore the building, this was the idea. They would find this inscription and read text. It's not particularly unusual. It begins with the name of the king and his title. It then points out that the building inscription was for a temple of this goddess Dinitu. Talks a little bit about the earlier building history of the temple, and then ends with a blessing for later prince who would restore the temple. Nothing in this building inscription is particularly unusual at first glance, but when we look at it in more detail, we actually see something that is not quite the way it normally is. And that is, you can see this here on both these slides, it's the fact that the tablet actually includes an ancient correction made by an ancient Assyrian scribe before the tablet was buried in this foundation deposit. You can see here that originally the name of the goddess for which this sanctuary had been dedicated was not Dinitu, but rather Belet Akkadi. That means the mistress of Akkad or of Babylonia. And at some point that name was replaced by the name of Dinitu. Why? We can't be sure, but there is some certain likelihood that it happened because of ideological reasons. Given that Tukulti-Ninurta was about to conquer Babylonia, he might not have wanted to worship a sort of specifically Babylonian goddess in his Ishtar temple. The name of the goddess, Dinitu, is also a bit of a mystery. It seems like that this is a deity, you could say, invented by Tukulti-Ninurta. She's not attested prior to his reign, and we do not even know exactly how to read her name. Cuneiform signs can always be read in different ways. The sort of most natural way to read the name would be Dinitu, but it is also possible that her name is to be read as Salmanitu, in which case she might have been the female counterpart to a god by the name of Salmanu, who was worshipped in the city of Durkat Limbo, you see here on the map on the left, which became something like the western capital of the Assyrian kingdom during the reign of Tukulti-Ninurta's grandfather, Adad-Nirari I. So it may be that Tukulti-Ninurta wanted sort of a female counterpart to that western deity in his eastern capital at Ashur during his reign. We cannot be absolutely sure. It would have been another interesting innovation on the part of the king. Be that as it may, perhaps there were a few too many revolutionary new things that the king tried. At any rate, in 1197, Tukulti-Ninurta was murdered by one of his sons, and thus his reign came to a rather, well, sad end. And the temple of Ishtar that he had built was soon thereafter walled up and eventually collapsed, and over it private houses were built, and altogether it remained buried under debris for some 3,000 years, until in the early 20th century excavations at Ashur were initiated. Those excavations followed suit to the excavations of other Assyrian capitals in the mid-19th century, mostly by French and British scholar explorers in Nineveh and Kalach and Dur-Sharrukin. Those French and British archaeologists were already aware that Ashur too might be an interesting site, but since they didn't find the same monumental artwork, these bull colossi and stone stelae that they found at Kalach or at Nineveh, they never started excavations at Ashur. And so it was the Germans in 1903, under the, with the German Oriental Society, that started those excavations. Those excavations took place under the patronage of the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, who was an amateur archaeologist himself, very interested in archaeology and the ancient Near East, later on even wrote a book about it. And we're under the direction of a very interesting man, Walter André. You can see here that he was an artist. This is actually a self-portrait of André. But he was also really important archaeologist, in a way one of those people who invented archaeology as a scientific discipline. So André was not just there on an educated treasure hunt, but he was able to trace mud brick walls, which is quite difficult. He drew elaborate plans of buildings he found and of their stratigraphy. He photographed all the finds that he made, and he recorded all the find spots, all of which was new and quite revolutionary. Towards the end of André's excavations in 1913, the gold tablet in the Ishtar temple was uncovered, and you see here on the slide to the left the position of where it was found along with the silver tablet, on a carpet of beads underneath the stone dais that at this point has been removed. So this is where it came to the fore. You see it here together with the silver tablet on the right, before that tablet was cleaned. And on September 25th, as we learned from the excavation diary and the excavation journal that André kept, the discovery of the tablet was observed, and even the fact that there was this ancient correction was noted by André at this point. The German excavations at Ashur came to an end in the spring of 1914. Here you see how the boxes with the finds were loaded on rafts. Those rafts were then sent down to Baghdad, and in Baghdad a division of finds took place between the Germans on one hand and the Ottoman authorities on the other. At the time of the German excavations at Ashur, the city of Ashur and other Assyrian sites were still within the Ottoman Empire. And the division of finds was actually a complex and politically charged affair. It was only thanks to a secret treaty between the Germans and the Ottomans about division of finds from 1899 that the Germans were able to secure half of the finds for themselves. And even that wouldn't have been enough had not the Kaiser himself intervened in 1914 with the Grand Vizier, who then interfered with the Council of Ministers in Istanbul, and that enabled the Germans to receive half the finds. So some 455 boxes with finds for Berlin were loaded on a freighter, the Hiruskia, at Basra, and were sent headed for Germany in August 1914. However, they never arrived because on August 1st, 1914, as you all know, World War I broke out. The tablets, the Hiruskia and all its cargo were seized at Lisbon in Portugal. the tablets and other finds from Ashur were brought to the Portuguese city of Porto, modern Porto, and there they stayed for the next 12 years. For a while, the Portuguese even had the idea of creating a Syrian museum of their own. And it was only in 1926 that the Germans were finally able to negotiate the release of the tablets and their transfer to Berlin, where they arrived in September 1926, as you can see on the slide here on the right. This is an entry on the left in the inventory book of the museum. And again, you see that the gold tablet is really very well documented. Its arrival in Berlin is documented as well. You find here also a note in the inventory book that the tablet was missing since 1945. The tablet was published by Walter Andre in a book from 1935. You see a photograph from that book on the right. It was exhibited in the museum from 1934 to 1939. Then, after the outbreak of World War II, it was again packaged in boxes. Those boxes were stored in safe rooms in the museum. The museum was hit by bombs during the war, but those safe rooms were not affected by those bombings. But in 1945, after the conquest of Berlin by the Soviet troops and the German capitulation, there were a number of weeks of complete chaos and anarchy. And after that, the Soviet troops seized substantial numbers of artifacts from Ashur, including even some monumental ones like these reliefs shown here in the back of this exhibition room, and transported them to Leningrad and Moscow. Many of the artifacts were brought back to Berlin in 1958. At that time, the Vorderasiatisches Museum was in East Berlin. It was a satellite state, of course. The GDR, the German Democratic Republic, was a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and so this was an act of improving relations with Eastern Germany. But the gold tablet by now was lost. It was not among the finds. It was not among the returned artifacts that were brought to Berlin in 1958. It would resurface eventually in the United States, but that is a story that I leave right out now to tell you about. So thank you for the time being, for your attention.
Let me say, Eckart, that was absolutely fascinating. I want you to know the way you traced it was wonderful. The translation, even seeing the map. Thank you for the.
Well done, and good evening. Thank you, Michelle and Eckart. So the very special thing about tonight for me is I fought this case that ended up in 2013, and I never met Eckart Frahm. And tonight's the first night. And so for all these years, there's so much about this case that I haven't understood. So it's super special to hear what I'm hearing and the dimensions, and look very much forward to the questions. So,
Vice versa.
thanks. So how did I get involved with this? So I'm standing in court in the Southern District of New York, and I'm litigating a case over Nazi-looted art. And my adversary, who's in a wheelchair, a big shot from the law firm of Cleary Gottlieb, starts waving a newspaper at the judge. And it's this article. And he said, "Judge, the surrogate ruled that the museum lose, and that means that Mr. Dowd's clients will lose this case." Now, I had been litigating that Nazi-looted art case for about 5 years. It started in early 2005. It's now 2010. And my adrenal glands are going. Judge said, "Mr. Dowd, what do you have to say?" I'm Like, Your Honor, it just came out in the newspaper. It's not a high court that you have to listen to. How about I get a chance to read the article? So I escaped this close out of the courtroom, ran home, got my law journal and said, what's happening here? So I read this case, and it was a case from the surrogates court in Nassau County, which doesn't bind the judge. But that judge had the look on his face, like, finally, I can get rid of you, Dowd. You've been bothering me for 5 years over this really old case that I don't want to hear. And he had been really not very open to using his court to relitigate what he felt the issues of World War II. So I called up the lawyers and I said, what did you do? What's going on? Did you argue this? Did you argue that? They said, Mr. Dowd, can you please come over to our office? So that's how I met Fritz Weinshank and John Fisher. Fritz Weinshank was 92 years old. And I'll tell you a little bit about him. But that conversation led to me being retained to assist them and ultimately represent the German Museum. So the case involved a dispute between a brother and sister over a coin collection as she accounted for it to the court. And the brother said, no, it's not a coin collection. There's a very special gold tablet that belongs to a museum, and my sister is trying to cheat me out of the value of this special coin, or this special tablet. And so the brother writes to the museum to rat out his sister. The sister then realizes that the museum might get it, and one or the other of them write to the Republic of Iraq and beg Iraq to seize it so that the German museum doesn't get it. So this is the loving family that led us into this controversy. And the pater familias who had deceased, his name was Raymond Flamenbaum. And he was an Auschwitz survivor. Okay? So making this case multi-layered, very difficult, problematic. So I'm representing Holocaust victims, and I'm yelling at Germany that they have to win a case against a Holocaust victim. So it starts getting rather complicated. So as Eckart said, it's found in Great Neck, and the judge said, hey, German museum, you show up 60 years late, you're out of luck. The family is prejudiced. These poor people had no idea. Their father died. He suffered enough. We're letting him keep it. So the problem when you have the rule of finders keepers, right, is that all the true owners of many other claims are just out of luck. So I was faced with that dramatic problem. If this case stuck, I was out of luck. And I told you a little bit about the dispute between the siblings, the back and forth that they had. There's the tablet, which Eckart has shown you a few times. So you realize it's a tiny little thing. It's less than 2 inches long. You can just put it, and I did, in the palm of my hand, and very cool. So it weighs less than 10 grams. And there you see the fingers. This is a tiny little thing. So when they were digging down in all that rock, they found this tiny little thing that survived 3,200 years and made that wild trajectory that Eckart has described. And we got the translation that Eckart showed you. Now, I was like, they were like, we hired an Assyriologist. I'm like, what is an Assyriologist? I had no idea of any of this. So I'm getting up to speed to learn about the record in this case. And so Assyriology is someone who can read cuneiform and has that capability. So I Googled it, and this is what I found. And I found, what is an Assyriologist? And there was Eckart's. I'm like, this is great.
Yeah,
So-
that's true.
And so we never spoke. I did speak to some of the folks at the museum, and the director of the Vordradziata Museum, which is, as I understand it, a division of the Pergamon Museum. And the Pergamon Museum is generally known as the premier encyclopedic archaeology museum in the world, perhaps, right? Is that?
In Germany.
Well, no, I mean, who else? Is the Met? What? The Met is competitive? Okay. So the surrogate had read Eckart's report, obviously was not as impressed as the appellate courts later did, because we did win the case. And this amazing tale of the excavations were sort of a backdrop to the case, and I was focused on the legal principle of stopping the finders, keepers, losers, sweepers from creeping its way into New York law. And so some of the side issues you had to deal with were, did the Germans take it legally in the first place? And there's not really much law on that, but I did find the principle of partage, which is something that built many of the museum collections. We saw that, as in the Indiana Jones film, this man, Walter Andre, took out a big camera and every day was taking pictures and did it in cooperation with the Sultan. So the background seemed like it was legal, and I had to sort of defend against legal attacks from the adversaries on every angle of the case, including the legality that we really didn't have that much precedent on. And we found a book here, 1920 book, 2-book showcasing on Walter Andre's findings. That you can find as public domain. It was not, and meeting Eckart, he explained to me that a lot of the stuff I was looking at were not exactly the right things, so I've taken out the bad side.
You won your case.
But that was the book, but it won my case, right? This was a book that was written in 1922, where it was published, and the tablet was published in 1935, but I couldn't find the 1935 book for the presentation I did. And there you've seen that. So the first level of the appeal was in Brooklyn, at the Appellate Division, Second Department. Now, I didn't argue that appeal. That was argued by this man, Fritz Weinshank. So Fritz Weinshank, to make things easy, is a little Jewish guy who represents Germany. And he's 92 years old. He was the last one to be bar mitzvahed at the Mainz synagogue before the Nazis took over. He escaped to the United States, became a GI, was on the beaches at Normandy, came back, was a translator, or worked on the Nuremberg trials. And ever since he came back, he represented Germany from that post-war 1946 period through until I met him. So, an astonishing figure. So Fritz is 92. He has this case he cares passionately about. So what I do for this appeal that was argued here in Brooklyn, I'm Fritz's number 2. So I craft the brief, help him with the legal arguments, get him going. We show up at the courthouse. He can't hear. So he's arguing he can't hear any of the questions. And the appellate judges are what you call a hot bench. They ask tons of questions. So it becomes clear that he can't hear. The judges all say, we're going to fix this. They get up, leave. We get headphones for Fritz, which I didn't even know that they had this for the hearing impaired attorneys. The judges were so respectful of him. They all came back, and then he proceeded again with his argument, and he won. So Fritz got this returned and got that principle of finders keepers thrown out. 2 weeks later, Fritz dies. So he really ended his life doing exactly what he wanted to be doing. And his partner, John Fisher, said that case and that story really kept Fritz alive. And so I was fortunate that Germany selected me to carry the ball forward to the Court of Appeals. And they were using the defense of latches. They said latches is basically if you know you have some rights and you don't assert them and someone else acts because you didn't act, you can lose your rights. So if I see an artwork being auctioned and I know that's mine, and I let somebody buy that artwork at auction, I can't later come after the new purchaser. It's my fault. It's almost like a fraud that I've committed. The Latches Rule is something that goes back and forth, and federal courts seem to want to expand it to launder everything, and the New York courts are much more discerning about that. And I think they have the right rule in the Flamenbaum case, which I'll talk about. So that was the whole thing was, did the museum delay? Did the museum have to do something to put on the world on notice that this artwork had been stolen? And then we looked at the history of the museum. Germany didn't even have access to the museum during the whole Cold War period. So until, 91, 93, Germany was locked out of its own museum. So I'm like, well, what were they supposed to do, the German Republic, to report something missing that they didn't even have access to the inventory because the Soviets had occupied it? So that was one, line of reasoning. And then on top of it, what are you supposed to do? You're the German government. Who do you report it to if you know it already? Is there some duty to put it out on a missing register list? Is that duty one that's implied by law or implied by the facts? So these were the types of arguments. And the courts found ultimately that, and part of it, the argument is if the Mona Lisa is stolen, everybody knows it's stolen. And I said, this is like the Mona Lisa because it's a unique inscription. There's only one of it. And the Assyriologists tracked it through history. So nobody who's a halfway decent Assyriologist, which I argued was what the court should be thinking about, would in his right mind purchase one of these things because they would be able to trace it back like a unique identifier. So all these people talking about NFTs, this is like NFT territory, right? I mean, there's an original scribe thing. You can't make two of them. It's the real thing. So, as Michelle put out there earlier about the Lieber Code, the law of war incorporated, got rid of the spoils of war doctrine officially really in the Hague treaties of 1899 and 1904. So when we have the Nuremberg trials that come around after Nazi Germany, the reason what the Nazis did was illegal under national law was because those Hague conventions were violated. So it's this sort of American idea of Abraham Lincoln, who hired a Prussian to write down this American idea, of making the spoils of war doctrine officially illegal. So we argued in the case at the Court of Appeals that this applied. And the family came up with the story we think our father got it from a Russian soldier. And since the Russians had taken it legally under the spoils of war, then we got title through the Russian soldier, and we think it was traded for a carton of cigarettes. I'm we don't think that really works. And it didn't. The really rewarding and interesting thing was on the appeal to the New York Court of Appeals, we got friend of the court briefs from Holocaust victim groups around the country. Now think about it. Holocaust victim groups coming out and supporting a German museum. When you think about what the rule of law matters to those people, it just blows you away. And the Flamenbaum case is unique. There's nothing like it. New York is a beacon a unique jurisdiction where we have said no finders keepers. Also, it's a jurisdiction where you get the highest price for artwork in the world because we keep the market clean, because we have this strong public policy against not trading in looted art. So there was, this was after the Court of Appeals. We had, the judge did a ceremony where the tablet was turned over to Germany. That's me at the Court of Appeals arguing when I could afford a haircut. And it was a very special moment. There's you mentioned Ralph Wartke, that's him in the courtroom. He came with his magnifying glass, his white gloves. We had a photo op. We put him on a jet plane back to Berlin with this priceless tablet. And that's the story. And the surrogate said it represents humankind's required preservation of a treasure. Thank you.
Ray, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think this is such an important program for the precedence and the preservation of art. I just want to make a comment. And Ray and I have been talking about this program for how long doing it, Ray?
Quite a bit.
Quite a bit. What you have on back, the Friends of the Brief, the Amici, I just want to mention some of the names there that I saw. The Archaeological Institute of America. We certainly gave our first gold medal from the committee to AIA's Archaeology magazine. The Monuments Men was listed, and we've had a guest, I think at your program, but many others also, a daughter of one of the Monument Men. And that was very exciting. So you had all sorts of wonderful groups, and also the University of Pennsylvania. That's one of the major centers for archaeology. And it was very interesting to me. Jane Hickman comes from Penn, but also we've had speak Brian Rose a number of times. And there was an article in the Times recently on needing more monument men, and Brian had educated the American soldiers how to recognize the antiquities in Iraq. So that also relates here, too. So I thank you both. This has been extraordinary and a very, very important and significant lecture. Do we have